In this lesson, we build on the login system from Lesson 8 to add the ability to remember our users' login status even after they close their browsers. We'll start by automatically remembering users, and then add the ability to optionally remember them based on the value of a Remember Me checkbox.
At this point, users can log in and log out to our site, so we actually have a complete working login and authentication system. But nowadays, most websites give you some ability to remember the session, to remember the login status, even if you close down your browser. So if you come back much later, you're still logged in. The two most common models are remembering that login status automatically. So sites like GitHub and Bitbucket use that model. Then perhaps slightly more common than that is the Remember Me checkbox used by sites like Facebook and Twitter. In this lesson, we'll use permanent cookies to implement both models. In this section, we'll start by automatically remembering users using a permanent cookie to record their login status. As we'll see later on, this will make it easy to add a Remember Me checkbox as well. As usual, we'll get started by checking out a Git branch. And as I mentioned before, the basic login and advanced login used to be a single lesson, but now they're two lessons, so we have a different branch. That means there's an inconsistency in the branch name that you'll see throughout the rest of the lesson, but don't worry, the branch you see should be advanced login. Our method for persisting sessions is going to be to use, instead of session here, instead the cookies helper. So cookies is a Rails method that lets us put more permanent cookies that last even after the browser closes. And our general strategy will be very similar to the way we currently log users in. Let's look at that here in the sessions controller. So the way we log users in is we find by something unique, in this case the email address, and then we verified that the user exists, that it's not nil, and then we authenticate that user by comparing the password, this params of session of password, with the password digest. This happens automatically inside of has secure password, so this authenticate method does that comparison for us, but in this section we're going to have to write our own comparison. In the case of remembering permanent sessions, instead of the email, we'll actually use the user's ID, and instead of the password, we'll use a string of random digits called the remember token, and instead of the password digest in the database, there will be a remember digest. I mentioned before that this session helper automatically encrypts any cookies that get placed on the browser, but that's not the case with the cookies helper that we're going to use to make more persistent cookies. And in this context, there are four main attacks. The first is to use a packet sniffer to detect the cookies being passed over insecure networks, like a public Wi-Fi network. This might let an attacker grab the remember token, and we've solved that already by using secure sockets layer. Remember, we turned SSL on in production, so this prevents that session hijacking attack. The second attack is to compromise the database that contains the remember tokens, and the way we'll do that is the same way that we protect passwords. Instead of storing the raw remember token, we'll store a hashed digest version. A third kind of attack is called cross-site scripting, which involves putting, say, JavaScript into the site. You could do something like putting JavaScript into the user's name. But remember, Rails escapes out any sort of inserted JavaScript by default. Any tags, in fact, get escaped out. So that's going to be prevented automatically. And the fourth main attack is actually gaining physical control of a machine that has a logged-in user. There's no way to prevent that attack in general, but we'll minimize it by changing tokens every time a user logs out, and we'll also make sure to cryptographically sign any potentially sensitive information we place on the browser. In other words, we're going to simulate this behavior of session, which automatically encrypts the cookie. There is a way to encrypt the user ID, which we'll end up using with cookies. So we'll be sure to use that to minimize the chances of someone just inspecting the browser and finding the user's ID. Our basic plan goes like this. We're going to first create a random string of digits for use as a remember token. That's corresponding to the raw password. This is what would be in this context. Then we'll place that token in the browser cookies with an expiration date far in the future to make it a permanent session. And just as we saved the hash digest of the password to the database in the form of the password digest, we'll save a remember digest to the database. Then, just as with session of user ID, we'll place an encrypted version of the user ID, but a more permanent one using cookies. Then when a user comes into the site, we'll pull the user out using the ID. So instead of email, we'll use the ID. And then we'll have an authenticate method we'll have to write ourselves to verify that the remember token in the cookies matches the remember digest in the database. There are a bunch of steps there, but we'll go through them right now, and then we'll actually see this pattern again in lesson 10 in a couple of other contexts. In order to do this, we'll have to add a new column to the database. Let's take a look at the new data model. So remember, we added password digest in lesson 6. Now we're going to add remember digest. And because we're using this parallel structure, that we're using basically the same strategy of a unique ID, in the case of the password, it's the email, and in the case of the remember digest, it'll be the actual user ID. We're going to be able to use the same bcrypt machinery that we used for the password digest in the context of the remember digest. So let's run a migration. Oops. Here we go. Rails generate. We want a migration to add the remember digest to the users, so we can do that like this. Remember digest is a string, so we can put that here on the command line. All right, let's take a look at that migration. We have to refresh it here. There it is. So you can see that we gave Rails enough information to make the full migration. This to users told Rails we wanted to add it to the users table, and then we gave it the attribute and type. So that means we can just run this. We're ready to run it. All right, now let's figure out what we're going to use to create the analog of the password. So this is a remember token, the raw password. This isn't the digest. This is the thing that's actually going to be put on the browser. Let's open up a console. There are a bunch of different possible choices. Essentially, any long random string will work. They don't even have to be unique, because remember that users can have the same password. Like 2 different users could have the same password. But of course, it's more secure if the remember tokens are unique, or at least that the probability is very low that they're the same. So what I'm going to use is something that comes as part of a Ruby library called secure random. There are a bunch of different methods on secure random. You can look it up on the web. But the one I'm going to use is this. There's something called a base 64 string. So base 64 strings are strings of capital A through Z, lowercase a through Z, 0 through 9, hyphen, and underscore. So that constitutes 64 different possibilities. That's why it's called base 64. And the URL safe part constructs a string that's safe for use in URLs, which is really nice, actually. We'll be able to reuse this token in lesson 10 as a result. So this is an example. We can just do a few more. Because there are 64 possibilities for each of these, you can look at the length here. Each of these has length 22, so the probability that 2 of these remember tokens have the same value is 1 over 64 to the 22, which is pretty much 0. Let's make it a float. Yeah, so that's about 10 to the minus 40. So even though they don't have to be unique, they're virtually certain to be so. At this point, we have to decide where to put this token. And because we're going to use this in the context of users a lot, it's actually quite convenient to put it in the user model as a class method. Oops, I forgot to put the comment here, didn't I? Of course, you can see here, we made this user digest for the sake of the user's fixtures here, right? But now we're going to be able to use the same digest to create the hash digest of the remember token. So it's kind of cool. We get to reuse that. We're not going to call this remember token because we're actually going to use this to create different kinds of tokens, not just remember tokens. So this is more general than just a remember token. So this is the same thing I did here. This guy. And now I'm going to give each user a remember token and a corresponding digest in the database. So that's like this. This is a method on the user model. This is for a user instance. This is actually not a class method. This is an instance method. So we'll call this using something like current user.remember, or maybe just user.remember. And so what we want to do is actually give the user a remember token that we'll end up storing in the cookies. So the way to do that is like this. I'm going to assign the remember token. Remember, with assignment, I mentioned this briefly before, you need the self dot, otherwise it just creates a local variable called remember token. Use the new token. And then we'll use the update attribute method. To update the remember digest with the digest, this thing, of the token. We could do this. We could do self.update attribute, but it's unnecessary inside of the user model to put self dot there. This won't quite work. In fact, this might even cause our test to fail. Oh, I guess we don't actually call remember anywhere, so the test should still pass. But this will not work because, in fact, the user, although it does have a remember digest attribute by virtue of the migration we ran, remember the data model here, we do have a remember digest, but there's no remember token. Again, this is analogous to having a password and a password digest. So the way we got a password attribute was by using HashSecure password, and that automatically creates virtual attributes called password and password confirmation. But in this case, we have to create that attribute ourselves. And by virtual, I mean it doesn't exist in the database. So the way to do that in Ruby is with attr_accessor. So let's put in an attr_accessor for the remember token. There we go. So by calling user.remember, we'll arrange to endow the given user with a remember token that will exist just in memory, and also create a remember digest that will be persisted until we change it. When we log out, we'll actually set this thing to nil. With this remember method on users defined, we're now ready to remember user sessions, so we can actually remember users when they log in. The way we're going to do that is in the sessions controller. After logging the user in, we're just going to remember them. Of course, this doesn't exist. This is not the same as this method. This method needs to be invoked as user.remember. So this is going to be a remember helper. In fact, let's just open up this in a new column. In fact, this should cause us to go red if I save it, because this remember method does not exist. Yeah, there we go. I'll define that here. So we'll remember a user, and that will involve calling this user.remember method here. And then we need to set the cookies. There are two steps here. One is to set the user ID, just like this. In fact, we can just copy this. Now this is our first use of the cookies method. So this will work, cookies of user ID equals user.id. What we want to do is persist this cookie for some long period of time. And actually I misspoke, this will not work. Cookies actually take a hash. We actually need something like this. Value of user ID and an expiration. So expires. To have it last a really long time, the standard convention is to use 20 years from now. And in Rails we can write that like this. And we want it to be, this is in UTC, it doesn't really matter, but that's the standard convention. This is essentially equivalent to Greenwich Mean Time. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close. Let's take a look at what that is here. Remember we saw in lesson 4 that we could actually add methods to built-in Ruby classes. So this is an example of that. This is adding the years method to fixNum, base class of integers essentially. There we go, that's 2034, that's long enough, that's basically permanent. So this is the equivalent of a permanent cookie. But this sort of construction is so common in Rails that there's a shorthand for it. We can just do this, cookies.permanent, and then just give it the value. So this is the same thing. But this still has a problem, which is that it's just going to put the user ID unencrypted on the browser. So the way to encrypt it using cookies, remember it happens automatically with session, but with cookies we have to tell it should be signed. So this creates an encrypted permanent cookie corresponding to the user's ID, and then we'll be able to decrypt it on the next browser request. Remember, by virtue of calling user.remember, we've endowed this user here with the remember token via self.rememberToken equals user.newToken. So we want to store that too. That's the analog of the password. That's already a random string, so we don't need to encrypt it with signed. So this is equal to user.rememberToken. So if I save this, our test should be passing again. We're not actually testing this yet. We will test this. This is pretty tricky though to test this. The tests are still useful though. They'll catch really gross errors like not having a remember method defined, in this case here. Good, so we're green again. All right, so this works. This is now remembering the user. This will place these two cookies on the browser. But currently, our current user method only finds by the session. So what we want to do is modify current user here to pull out the permanent cookie if the user isn't logged in. So what happens here is that if the user closes the browser, this session goes away and current user will be nil. So if the session exists, we want to do this. We want if this is not nil, so we can just say if session of user ID, then do this. Else, this is when the user has closed the browser. So this is actually else if this cookies of signed, this signed cookie is present. So remember, this if this is nil, then it's also false. So we can do the same thing here. It turns out that we don't use permanent in this context. We just go like this. I'll copy it and then show you what we really do. So this is the way we pull out a signed cookie. Else if cookies.signed of user ID. And if this is not nil, well, so we only get to this branch if this is nil. So that means the user closed the browser. And if this is not nil in that case, then it means that there's a persistent session. So we should pull out that user. Find by ID, and then it's this. If this copying and pasting bothers you a little bit, it should. It should be ID colon. We'll eliminate that duplication in a moment. And so now let's take a look at the sessions controller. You can see the parallel structure here. So in fact, let's just scroll up here. So what we're doing here is the analog of this. User.findBy email. Now we're going to do user.findBy ID. And as we did here, if user, just copy this to show you that it's almost the same. if user and user.authenticate. Now this only works with password digest. This is part of has secure password. So what we're going to do is write our own authenticated question mark method. If user and user.authenticated authenticated with the remember token. So this is cookies of remember token. You can see from here, because it's not signed, we don't have to say cookies.signed. We can just say cookies of remember token. So if the user exists, that is to say not nil, and it's authenticated according to the remember token, then we'll log the user in and set the current user equal to this user. And because Ruby returns the last expression evaluated, this will just return as part of current user this value, which is just user. So this should actually be working. Let me save this and verify that. Oop, our tests are red. Let's see what the problem is here. Oh, we don't have an authenticated method yet. Okay, so we need to define user.authenticated, obviously. Obvious with hindsight. So let's define that here. And it's going to authenticate based on the remember token. So what this is going to do is compare the remember token to the remember digest. This is actually pretty tricky to do. The way to figure it out is to look at the has secure password source code. Remember we cribbed this stuff here from that source code. Let's take a look at that. So where does the comparison happen? The comparison happens here. Bcrypt password.new of password digest double equals unencrypted password. Now this is the comparison operator. If you think about what's going on here, this is really strange because unencrypted password might be something like foobar. And this is checking to see if bcrypt password.new of the digest is equal to that. But this implies that we're somehow unencrypting this. And you can see encrypted password and unencrypted password. That's wrong. Remember, that terminology is wrong. This is not encryption. This is one-way hashing. So this can't possibly be right. What really should be happening here is that it should be hashing this and comparing the hash of this to the password digest. And that's actually what this is doing, because in fact the bcrypt library overrides the meaning of double equals, which I think is really confusing. But this will work. We can try this. Do bcrypt, just copy it in. Instead of password digest, it's remember digest. And instead of unencrypted password, it's remember token. Remember, we don't actually have a test for this yet, but the test suite will still catch syntax errors or in this case, missing methods. Let's run the whole test suite again just to make sure we're green. Nope. Oh, what this has caught is that logout isn't working. And that's true. We haven't yet forgotten a user when they log out. So let's defer that for now. In fact, I can even show you something kind of tricky here. This is user's login test. Line 33, so we can actually skip this for now. This gets us to yellow. This is a reminder that we actually have something that we want to come back and fill in. But it's nice not to be in an error state. So let's fix this up though. So remember I was mentioning this is really confusing looking. This will work though. This is actually working. The logout doesn't work, but the remembering is working. But I think the syntax is so confusing that I'd rather use an alternate. It's still not great, but it's a lot better. So this is the same thing, it turns out, if you look in the bcrypt library as this bcrypt password.new of remember digest dot is password question mark and then token. So let's check this out. Let's log in. And now let's just quit this whole thing. So quit Opera, restart it, and I should still be logged in. And I am, look at that. But of course, log out doesn't work. If we click on log out, you can see I'm still logged in. So that's actually great that our test caught that. Of course, we do need to fix that, but before moving on to that, I want to show you how to eliminate this duplication I mentioned before. So here we've got session of user ID, session of user ID. What we can do is make a local variable called user ID. Could do something like this. And then just not access the session twice. So this will also work, but this is not idiomatically correct Ruby, because it turns out that you can just stick this in the if. Like that. Now this is potentially very confusing, because this is not saying if user ID is equal to session of user ID. That would be this, the double equals. This is an assignment. I like to put it in parentheses just as a visual reminder that this is not a comparison. So obviously this is possibly very confusing, but this is really common. So it's important that you know what this actually does, because you'll see this in other people's code all the time. Do the same thing down here. There we go. That's the final version of the current user, although I should get rid of this here. There we go. This is really complicated logic in here, and in fact, this is the sort of thing that once you have more experience with test-driven development, this is exactly the kind of thing that's probably a good idea to test drive. But we are going to write a test for this later on. As we've seen, there's only one thing not working, which is that we can't log out. And that's because this logout method only deletes the session, to say the session of user ID. To forget the information, let's make a forget method corresponding to this remember method. So let's do this. And to go along with this user.remember, let's do user.forget to undo the remember. Oops. And then let's clear those cookies. So it's cookies.delete. The cookies method has a delete method just like session. Cookies.delete, and it's the same kind of syntax. Give it the key. So there's user ID, and there's also the remember token. And inside of here, we want to, let's see, we want to call the forget inside of logout. Forget the current user. Now we can actually get rid of the skip here. And we need to define this forget method. So what's going on here? Something weird going on in the test. All right, and exited. Let's just kill the Spring processes. Define this here. Forget the user, and then, well, actually, we don't need to do forget of user. This is a different method. This is the method on the user, so this is just corresponding to this user.forget. And then we just want to undo this here. And the way to do that is just to update the remember digest with nil. So update attribute, remember digest nil. Of course, we could set the remember token to nil as well, but there's no need to do that because by virtue of making the remember digest nil, this token can't be used to log in anymore. At this point, the remember machinery is basically working, but there are a couple of really subtle bugs in our program, and I want to show you how those work. So the first subtlety is related to this method here, this logout inside of destroy. So this causes a problem if we do something like this. If we have one browser window where we log in, click login, and then open another browser window in the same place. It's just so what happens if we log out here? Now we're logged out, but over here we're still, well, we're logged out, but it looks like we're logged in. So in particular, we can do this, and that causes an error. So what's happening here is that we've actually clicked on that link, and it gets routed to destroy, and we're trying to log out, but there's no way to log out because in user.forget, the user is nil. And the reason for that is because we're doing forget of current user, but current user is nil when we log out. This is the sort of thing that's so subtle that I really like to write a test before fixing it. So we can actually fix it just by calling logout only if the user is logged in. It's very easy to fix. But first I'm going to write a quick test. Go to here. So this is the user's login test. That's what we're using to test this sort of stuff. That's right here. So after logging out, it's here. Let's log out again. So we're just going to do delete logout path. We get the same error. This is what happened before. The current user is nil, so we can't call forget on it right here. So we can fix it over here by doing this. It should be green. Great. The second problem is even subtler, and I should mention that both of these subtleties were pointed out by Rails tutorial readers, which I really appreciate. So let me show you this. This is incredibly subtle. So suppose that I'm logged in two different browsers. So here's Chrome and here's Opera. So I'm logged in both of these browsers. Suppose now I log out over here. Because this forgot the user, it just changed the remember digest from what it was before to nil. Now this still works fine in Opera. If we click around, go to the profile. And that's because of this session. It's now pulling out the session of user ID, so it's never hitting this branch. But what happens if I close Opera? If I quit and restart it, now it gives me an error. What happened here is now the session is gone, this is gone, so it's hitting this branch of current user. It's saying, oh, I still see cookies signed of user ID. It's pulling the user out because that user is valid. So this is not nil, this user. And so it's hitting user.authenticated. It's getting to this part of the if statement. And that then goes over here and calls this. And that calls bcrypt password.new of remember digest. But remember, when we logged out in Chrome, it set the remember digest to nil. So that's what caused this error. This is the error that gets raised. Bcrypt error is invalid hash. The invalid hash in this case is the result of remember digest being nil. We can fix this just by returning false if the remember digest is nil, so it never gets to this line. But as before, I'd really like to write a test to catch the problem. So let's go to the user test. So let's add a test for the authenticated method. Of course, before we wrote an integration test, but it's really hard to write an integration test that simulates this two-browser scenario. But luckily, it's pretty easy to test right in the model. Now, it actually doesn't matter which remember token. Remember, we're calling this authenticated with a remember token, but it doesn't matter because it's never going to get there. This digest is nil. So what's going on here is that this @user is not saved. So this @user doesn't have a digest. Its remember digest is nil. So it doesn't matter what token we give it. Let's just give it an empty string. Oops, it should be authenticated question mark. Right, so this here should return false if we call authenticated question mark when the @user has no remember digest. So this is failing. It's actually an error because it's an exception. So we can just return false if remember digest is nil. There we go. So if we refresh this, now it works fine. By the way, you could definitely do something like if remember digest.nil false else this here. So you could do if else, just like this. This is the same thing. But I like the explicitness of just saying, just return. If the remember digest is nil, return right away, don't do anything else. But the two are equivalent. All right, with those two subtle bugs tested and fixed, our remember machinery is now completely working. This is essentially equivalent to what you might find on an industrial grade website like GitHub or Bitbucket. When you go to log in, it will now remember this session for 20 years, unless I log out. Now that our application can remember users, let's complete the third of the three models by adding a Remember Me checkbox. Take a look at the mock-up. We looked at this before, but here it is. So we're going to add this sort of checkbox to the login page. This involves opening up the new page for users, the login page, or sorry, the new page for sessions. This is the form to create new sessions. So let's add a label. Called Remember Me, and we're going to give it some classes. In order to get the styling right, we actually want the box to be inside this label, so I'm going to put a block here. This is one of the things that Ruby can do, is that here we have f.label and then just the symbol, but here we've got the symbol, we've put some classes, but then we're also going to pass it a block. And inside this, I'm going to put a checkbox. Let's see what that did. Right, so that actually worked. The styling isn't quite right, but we'll fix that up in a moment. We can see if we click this. Well, actually, this is going to actually work, yeah. It didn't do anything. I mean, it did remember it because it's remembering by default. So let's put in some invalid information. See what happens. All right, so you can see down here that we've got session, here's the session hash, email, password, and remember me is 1. So when we check the box, remember me is 1. And when we don't check the box, remember me is 0. Let's fix that styling. This is going to be in the forms section. We can just add it to the bottom here. And this is not, again, very important to know the details, so I'm just going to copy it from the book. Just copy this in. Save it and take a look at it. Just log in. Good, so this is more the styling we expect. So let's submit it one more time. Just want to remind you what it is. We just looked at it. But here it is. It's session of remember me tells us whether that checkbox is checked or not. So in the sessions controller, after logging in the user, we should remember the user only if that checkbox is checked. So we can do that like this. Params of session remember me. So this is, if this is equal to 1, let's just do this. If that's equal to 1, we want to remember the user. Else, we want to forget the user. So we'll forget the user if the box is unchecked. Save that, and this is actually working now. It's amazing how little code is required. It's because of all the work we did before. So we can go to Opera, log in, remember me, copy this here, quit, open up Opera again, and you can see that I'm still logged in. If I log out, log in here, if I log in this way, now it won't remember me, I can quit. And you can see I'm not logged in. By the way, the reason we want to forget the user is because of the following scenario. So ordinarily, you wouldn't go back to the login page, right? If you log in like this, you wouldn't then go to the login page. In fact, we might even, as a design choice, just redirect someone away from this page. But there is something that could happen. Suppose that I log in here, and I have another window with the same URL. Right, so suppose that I log in here. I just remembered the user. But now if I log in over here with the remember me box unchecked, I do want that to forget the user. So now if we quit out, let me just copy this. It should now forget that session. Right, so I'm not logged in. So this is working. This is a working remember me checkbox. There's just one refinement, which is to combine this into something a little shorter. We saw this briefly before. Let me move this over here. We're actually going to use this question mark colon syntax. This is called the ternary operator, and it basically works like an if-else. So, oops, over here, params of session of remember me equals 1, question mark, remember user. Just put this into one line. After all the work we've done building all this machinery, the remember me checkbox is actually just adding one line, handling it. Run the test. This is really nice to have tests to catch stuff. You can see we have 3 errors there, and that's because while we can omit the parentheses normally, Ruby doesn't know how to parse this line, so to get this to work, we do have to put in the parentheses. There we go. So this is a working remember me checkbox. It's pretty amazing. And at this point, we have successfully implemented all three of the most common models for logging users in on the web. But there's a lot of complicated stuff here. This is fairly intricate, this login here, the create action. And then we've got this current user, which is really complicated. So I think it's a really good idea to write some tests. And in fact, when I originally implemented this, I did this. I actually wrote this. You can see our tests will pass. They'll be just fine. But remember, when we submit this thing with the box unchecked, go here, it's actually 0, right? It's either a 0, I think it's probably just the string 0 in here. But even if it's the number 0, both of those are true in Ruby. So this ternary operator works like this. There's a Boolean test, question mark, this thing gets evaluated if this is true, and this thing gets evaluated if this is false. So it's like this if else. But if this is 0, it's still true. So what happens here is it always just evaluates remember if user. So I actually implemented this wrong when I first did it. And that just underscores how important it is to have a test. Writing this test is actually pretty tricky. And so I want to start off by editing the test helper. We're going to add a method to log users in inside of tests. I mentioned before that we were going to do this, but now the time has come. It's especially tricky because the way we log users in will depend on whether it's a regular sort of controller or model test, or if it's an integration test. This is just a quick insert with an updated way for writing this login method inside of tests. The way to do this has changed as of Rails 5, so we need to update the method. It's still true that it's going to be different based on different kinds of tests, but actually the controller and integration tests are unified, and the model tests will be different. So let's take a look at that. Let's open the test helper here. And inside of this here active support test case, we can look at this user test. It's the kind of test for a model test like that, active support test case. So inside of here, this is going to be the thing that will get called in a model test. We actually won't use this in this lesson, but we'll use it later. And this is going to be really simple. We're just going to manipulate the session directly. We're going to say log in as, and then just the user. And then we're going to say the session of user ID is just that user's ID. Unfortunately, this method won't work inside of integration tests, which is now also the class for controller tests. To here, action dispatch integration test. But what we can do is open up that class inside here. We can just copy it. And then we'll add in the login method. And we'll just use the same name because we don't really want to have to keep track of which kind of test we're in. It doesn't really matter to us. So we'll do this, and as we'll see, we'll actually have to change this. It's just this login as user, but we'll do something else here. Because inside of an integration test, which is also the same as a controller test now, in terms of the class, the way to log in is to post to the login path. We'll post the params session, and we'll put in the user email. So that's the email parameter. But then we also need the user password. And the problem here is that users don't know their own passwords. There's a password digest, but this here has to be the plain text password. So what we're going to do is add that to the login as method as a keyword argument. We're just going to use the default here, but it's nice to have it as an option so we could change it. Remember, user.yaml, we just standardized on user.digest of password. So the string password is just the standard password, and we'll be using that convention for other users as well in the test database. So here the password is password. And it's important to emphasize that this here is what gives rise to this here. So I could call this foo. If this were foo, this would be foo. So we just use the same name for convenience, but it can be a little confusing. And then there's one more thing we can do. Remember, when we post the login path through the form, there's a remember me checkbox too. So let's add that in here. And that's going to be, well, either 0 or 1. Let's just make it 1 by default. So for true, we do want them to remember me. There we go. We should be ready to test now. So now we're ready to go back to the previous version of the screencast with this new method, but otherwise the code should work as indicated. And now we're in a position to test that the login functionality is working with the two different kinds of checkboxes. So that's going to go in the user's login test right here. This over here. And I'm going to make a couple of new tests. Let's start with login with remembering. So let's log in as, well, we've got an @user, right? Yep, we've got an @user from the fixtures. So let's do login as that user. And then remember me is going to be 1. And now we have to decide how we're going to test this exactly. It's possible to check that the cookie of remember token is actually equal to the user's remember token, but the implementation is a little tricky, and that's left as an exercise. Instead, what we'll do is almost as good, which is to check that the cookie is not nil. You might expect that this would work. Assert not nil. Cookies of remember token. And indeed, I expected this to work, but you can see that it does not work. Expected nil to not be nil. And the reason it didn't work is because of this really weird little subtlety that has been around for years, so far as I can tell, that inside tests, cookies of a symbol remember token does not work, but cookies of the string remember token does. So this should pass. There we go. So we can copy this, log in without remembering, remember me 0, and this should be assert nil. There we go. By the way, this catches that error I mentioned, where I said I did this when I first implemented it. See, that now fails. Expected this remember token to be nil, but it wasn't. So that's this failing right here. The final thing I want to do is to test this part of the sessions helper, this current user, and in particular this branch, the branch that corresponds to a user that is visiting the site after having closed the browser. And so we can do something like this. I really like to do this. I'm just going to put raise. This is raising an exception inside this branch. You can see that the tests are still green, and in fact the whole test suite is green. This is a really nice way to show that this part of the code is not being tested. So now we want to write a test to get to red, something that actually hits this branch of the current user method. It's really hard to do this inside of an integration test to simulate closing the browser. It can be done, but it's incredibly cumbersome. By far the easiest way to do it is to test the sessions helper directly. So we want to actually write a test for this current user method. To do that, I want to make a sessions helper test file. So if we look here, we can look at test helpers. There is a directory for helpers, but there's nothing in it right now. So let's make one of those files. Let's open it up. We need to refresh it here. I could have just double-clicked on it. It was right here. To get started, we can copy over something. I just want to show you how you would do this if you didn't know offhand. Go to the sessions controller test. So we want something like this here. Let's paste this in. Instead of sessions controller test, I want sessions helper test. So sessions helper test. And then let's write the test, just a test for the current user. So what we want to do is hit this branch, and if we look at current user, the way to do that is to call current user when the session is nil, but when the user has been remembered. So we can do that like this. Let's pull a user out of the fixtures. And then let's remember that user. So that will define the cookie, that will define this cookie. Remember, we're calling remember here. So that sets the cookie, but the session inside of this sessions helper is nil. Remember, that session gets set if we log in, but we haven't logged in at all. This is just defining a raw user and remembering it by calling these sessions helper methods directly. Let's put in an assertion. Certainly it's the case that this user should be equal to the current user. So this is our call to current user right here. Just paste it in. The order here is actual expected, so we expect that the actual user to be equal to the current user. So if I save this, this should give me a failing test. Right, so what's happening here is it's coming into this branch. Session of user ID is nil, but this cookie has been set by remember of user, and then it's hitting this exception. So you can see, oops, actually there's something else. No, look, it says no method error, undefined method remember. So that's actually not what's happening. We can verify by removing this raise that in fact it's still red. And the reason is actually quite subtle. I didn't copy from my own book. In fact, copying from the controller test was wrong. It's actually action view test case. Where do we have that? Search in the project. Interesting. So we actually don't have it anywhere here. All right, well, this is why you have a Rails tutorial book. It tells you things like this. Let's restore the raise here, and then save this over here. All right, so this should be red, but now it should be red. Yes, because it's a runtime error. That's coming from this raise. So if we copy this or cut that out, now it should be green. The whole suite should be green. Great, so now it's actually hitting this branch. So if we do anything in here, if we copy or if we cut that out, it should go red. But it didn't. The test suite is still green. So this is a bug. We should definitely catch this. It's not quite as serious as it looks because we still need to have a valid user ID. And this is encrypted, but this is not good. Right now, we definitely should have to authenticate based on the remember token. So if we eliminate this, essentially this is now not using the remember token at all. So what we need to do is make a test that resets the user's remember token and then verifies that this current user returns nil. So let's leave this like this. We want to get to a red test to catch this. So now I'm going to reuse that @user This user will become @user. And we want to remember that user. And let's change this to test current user returns user when session is nil. Returns the right user. Session is nil, and then, actually let me close this. It's the same thing, except instead of user, it's @user. So this should still be green. And now we want test current user returns nil when the remember digest is wrong. So this is assert nil current user. Although actually this isn't quite right. We need to change the user's digest. So what we want to do is get a mismatch so that this authenticated method returns false. So let's do that. We can do that like this, @user.update attributes, or update attribute, just one, right? Remember digest, and let's just use the digest. Could be anything, but let's use the right code. So we've just given it a digest that does not match the digest that corresponds to the token put into the database here, or put into the cookies. So this should be red. Good. And now when we restore this code, it should be green. Great. So now everything in this branch should be tested. Anything we change, if we eliminate this, something should fail. Oh, in fact, this is another omission. The user should be logged in. Oh, it should be here. It should be assert. Assert is logged in. There we go. Well, it's amazing the number of things that can go wrong, but I think we've got a green test suite now that tests pretty much every branch of that current user method. That's great. All right, we've covered a huge amount of ground in the last two lessons. We've gone from a site where a user couldn't even sign up, and now a user can both sign up and log in and log out. And we've added 3 different models, starting with the basic model where users log in, but then the login status gets forgotten, and then building all the way up to this remember me checkbox. So to me, this really feels like magic. Like, I've seen these little checkboxes all over the web, and I remember the first time I learned how to do this, and I thought, that's amazing. It's so exciting that I actually understand how these little things work. Let's deploy this thing to production. Let's run our test suite. We just did it, but I always like to do this before doing any sort of merges. All right, we're still green. Add all the files. Make a commit, and let's merge it in to master. We can push it up. And now let's deploy to Heroku. Now, there's one thing that I'd like to show you here. It's a little dangerous to make pushes that require a migration. In this case, the remember digest got added. So one thing you would want to do in real life is to put Heroku into maintenance mode before doing a deploy like this. Let me show you how to do that. Put the maintenance on, and actually let's open it up. Go to Gentle Garden. So this is application offline for maintenance, so this is maintenance mode. Now let's do our push. Now we can run the migration. And turn maintenance off. There we go. We refresh, it should be working. All right, let's take a look in Opera, because I want to quit out. All right, let's go to login. Just submit like that, get our invalid email password combination. Can log in as myself here. And if I quit this, should not be logged in still. So that worked. You can see now the login link appeared. Let's try it again, except with Remember Me. Quit. And there we go, still logged in. If we want, we can even look at the cookies. You can see we've got 3 cookies here from Heroku app. Sample app session, this has the regular ID from session of user ID. You can see here, expires when the browsing session ends. Then Remember token, which expires 30 years from now, or 20 years from now rather. And the user ID, which also expires 20 years from now. You can see the content here is encrypted. This is not just the plain user ID, but the token is just the token. And of course, we can log out. So at this point, our login, logout machinery is complete. All that is needed to complete the authentication functionality is to restrict access to pages based on login status and user identity. We'll accomplish that en route to giving users the ability to edit their information, which is this here, under Settings, which is the main goal of the next lesson. After that, we'll add account activation and password resets, and at that point, the core of the application will be complete, and we'll be ready to start adding the Twitter-style functionality in Lesson 11 and Lesson 12.